All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Chimaoge OziIbeNwuku. You can also call me Onyeishi, which just means Professor Ibenwuku in Igbo. Choose whichever language you prefer, although Igbo is better. And welcome to Chimaoge's Comments. Today, I am going to be talking about Kemet. Why Kemet? Basically, just because I asked my little sister what my first topic should be, and she said Kemet. So I'm doing Kemet. Shout out to the little sister. Um, Now, this is part of the Dr. John Henrik Clarke historical lecture series. You can see I have a picture of Dr. John Henrik Clarke up there, great great black scholar and historian. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different topics on this channel, but whenever I'm talking about something that's primarily historical, it'll be part of the historical lecture series and be doing it in the name of Dr. John Henrik Clarke. So I hope to channel his spirit. Now, Kemet. Um, Many of you probably know what that is. Many of you don't know what it is. Many of you have heard of it, but you don't know you've heard of it for reasons that I'm going to cover. But I'm going to break this lecture into three basic parts. First part is the rise of Kemet. The second part is Kemet like as it was, I guess you can say, just saying what it was like. And the third part is the fall of Kemet, right? So let's start the rise of Kemet. Let me just unzip my Arsenal jacket here a little bit. So let me take this off. Give me a second, guys, because it's kind of steamy in here. You know what? Let me show off my beautiful arms a little bit. Anyway, all right. Now, part one, the rise of Kemet. I hope you guys can see this map of Africa I drew here. It's a crude little map, but it's gonna look like a diamond to you all when I'm done because of all the knowledge I put on this thing. If you can see it, camera's pretty hazy, but we go on. Anyway, so to talk about the rise of Kemet, first we got to talk about the rise of human civilization. So you'll often hear that human civilization begun in East Africa. However, oh, and by the way, just so y'all know my sources, I'll post most of them. If you're watching this on a visual platform, you're watching the video version of this lecture, you'll see as many sources I can find and remember posted in the description of the video. Basically, my sources for this are basically everything I've read, heard, and watched on Kemet, as well as just my own deductions. I'll try and let you know what everything's coming from as much as I can, but the lecture needs to flow, so I can't, throw in a footnote every 10 seconds. But anyway, so you'll often hear that human civilization began around here in East Africa. They commonly say Ethiopia. However, most of the sources that I have seen and heard actually indicate that's not true. It's true that the earliest hominid fossils were found in East Africa. But if you're talking about Homo sapiens, which are human beings, the oldest evidence of human being societies actually is on the western half of the continent. And for those of you who don't know, a hominid, we're the only hominids left, but in the past there used to be other hominids, which are essentially like a species of organism that's very close to us. I'm going to talk about them a bit more later on in the lecture, but think of like the Neanderthals. You guys have heard of those, like your stereotypical cavemen, at least the ones that weren't quite human, or like think of like Bigfoot, right? If Bigfoot existed or exists, that would be another hominid that's not human. So essentially, a hominid could be something that humans evolved from, or a close relative that's a different species. But anyway, in East Africa, we have the oldest hominid fossils, but the oldest human fossils, evidence of human civilization, is actually in the western half of the continent. They're found both here in Igbo land, and of course I'm proud of that because I'm Igbo. Yeah, but then also there's artifacts of a similar age kind of north of that. Now we have more evidence that humanity would have started in Igbo land, just because we can also look at the population density of Igbo land and the genetic diversity of the Igbo people, both of which would indicate that those populations are very old and have been there a long time. However, it's possible that the people who left the artifacts north of that at around the same time would have been just as old or older. However, we don't have access, or at least nearly as much access, and I don't think anyone has found it if it's out there, to their genetic evidence. And certainly we don't have access to their population density because, for reasons that I will go into later, the people who originally inhabited um, this area and all of North Africa are really no longer there. But anyway, you have human beings on the western half of the African continent. Then they migrate all over the rest of the continent, right? And then eventually they go outside the continent. And those people who go outside, keep them in mind because they're going to come back later. But anyway, these human beings, right? Many of them, after leaving the western half of the continent, um, and by the way, when I'm talking the western half of the continent, it would be the area that would be commonly now referred to as sub-Saharan Africa, although the Sahara, which is commonly called the Sahara Desert, but that's redundant because Sahara just means desert in a different language. But that desert did not exist at this time for reasons that, again, I will go into. But anyway, from that region of Africa, or maybe the northern half, but probably below, right here in around modern Igbo land, they leave. Some of them migrate to the Nile River Valley, right? I'm sure you've all heard of the Nile River, the longest river in the world. Very crucial here. They kind of settle at the southern portion of the Nile River. And by the way, the southern portion of the Nile River is known as the Upper Nile. The bottom portion is known as the Lower Nile. That might be a bit confusing to some people because if you look on a map, the lower part is above the upper part. But they were looking at things from a different perspective. But anyway, and that's typically how it's noted. But anyway, they settle in the Lower Nile, but gradually they go down the Nile, or the Upper Nile rather. Gradually they go down the Nile until they've populated around the whole thing on the up to the Lower Nile, and this is what is commonly referred to as the Nile Valley culture, right? And this wasn't just one civilization. There wasn't just one country or one political structure here. There are many different peoples that settled along here, but they did have a generally common genetic origin and common cultural similarities, which is why they're commonly just referred to as the Nile Valley culture. Now, to understand who these people were in contemporary terms, first of all, these people were black. They were Africans because everyone on Earth at this point was black, African. People who weren't African just didn't exist yet, and we'll get into when they came into the picture. But then also, there's different varieties of black African people. But these people were what are known as the Nilotic people, right? And these people are still around today. Many of them are still living along the Nile Valley. But Nilotic people, they get that name from the Nile Valley because they first kind of developed around there, like Nilotic. So these people, they have certain physical characteristics. They tend to be very tall, among the tallest people on Earth. I believe they tend to even get taller than Dutch people, who are also very tall. Also very dark skinned. They have very coarse hair, broad nose. So, they look very similar to me, except just taller and darker. But anyway, yeah, Nilotic people. They're also very renowned for their lung capacity, and scientists theorize that they have this lung capacity because it helps them essentially deal with the heat better because they can. I think it's like they release the oxygen faster or something like that. But anyway, so those are the kind of people that live here, and gradually, right? Some of these people, remember, they moved from the southern part of the Nile, the upper Nile, down the river to the lower Nile. And in this southern part, it's commonly referred to as Nubia, at least one region here. So they moved from Nubia into this lower part of the Nile. And then there's certain other groups here, certain other Nilotic groups. And over time, these Nilotic groups, in kind of the more upper part of the Nile River, the upper part, or lower part rather, lower Nile, lower part of the Nile River basin, they begin to consolidate into one political structure. And eventually, it does become one political structure. And this nation, this country, refers to themselves as Kemet. They also use a couple other names like Waseti, and it's debated exactly how Kemet was pronounced. But that is what they call themselves, or at least one of the things, and that's the name I'll primarily be using to describe them today. Now, this is commonly referred to as the unification of Kemet, but from what I've read, the unification of Kemet, it wasn't like one event. It's not like someone just went wham bam in 2 years the whole thing was united. It's just, as I said, gradual unity. People gradually, making alliances, conquering other people. But the person who's commonly given credit for uniting Kemet is known as Narmer. There are some other names. I'll say that there's some other names who are given credit for this unification as well. Like Menes is another one. But most historians seem to agree that Narmer and Menes are probably the same person, just because people would have different names for different purposes, especially people who were a pharaoh, because Narmer was a pharaoh. I'll get into what that was later. But that's the person who's commonly given credit for the unification, I guess, because he gave it that final push to really consolidate it, but it really was a gradual process. So anyway, after that point, Kemet exists. And mind you, the Nile Valley civilization began tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago. But Kemet, there is some debate among historians the exact date when Kemet became one nation. The earliest date I've seen was, according to the European time numbering system, 4500 CE, which would be about 6,500 years before now. But then, according to some other sources, they'll say 3100 CE, which would make that 5,100 years from now. And FYI, the black scholars tend to place the date earlier than the Caucasian scholars. But I haven't looked in depth to see exactly who's right. But we know, obviously, some of the political agendas behind putting the dates at different times. But anyway, then Kemet was founded. So now, Kemet exists. So what was Kemet like? Now, first, there are said to have been, I believe, 26 dynasties of Kemet before their first. No, it was 15 dynasties of Kemet before their first conquest, mind you. And the dynastic period, which began with Narmer, right? Because the first person who unified Kemet is said to be the first pharaoh, and each pharaoh has a dynasty, right? So that lasted for thousands of years. But there's said to be, there were dozens of dynasties, but before Kemet's first conquest, and mind you, now we're into the second part of the lecture. This is what Kemet was like. I told you about the rise. Now we're into what it was like. But now when we're talking about what it was like, right, there are 15 about dynasties before its first conquest. And the conquest I'll talk about in the third part, the fall, right? But anyway, there are about 15 of those. each one is measured by the, I guess, family that was ruling, right? And these are the families who held the position of pharaoh. So now, what was pharaoh? So pharaoh is commonly translated as king, but it was not a king. King, we have to remember, is a Eurasian, largely Eurasian. Maybe can't say technically that no African ever had a king before a certain point, but I'm not really aware of any that had a leadership position that could be accurately described as a king, although positions often get mistranslated as king. But the pharaoh is not a king because a king is someone who owns the land you're on. So, like for example, the um, historical kings of England literally owned England. England was like their backyard, but then they had the grace to allow the other human beings who they had, beat over the head to get the right to that land to live on the land. That's why to this day, the queen, who's obviously the descendant of those kings, is known as her grace because she's just so nice for letting people exist. But anyway, that is not what was going on in Kemet. The pharaoh really was more of a spiritual position, and this will be getting into science and metaphysics, which again I'll be covering in a second. But the pharaoh was a spiritual leader who handled spiritual duties, and I know this based upon my study and listening to other people who studied African systems of government and spirituality. And we know that obviously there are variances, but they're generally quite similar. And I've heard people say that the pharaoh was a king. Like I know in one of his lectures, the late great Dr. OziIbeNwuku said that. But yeah, the pharaoh is not a king. He was a spiritual leader who had spiritual duties that he performed for the good of the whole nation. So this would include stuff like, praying for peace, praying for abundance, that kind of stuff, and all these other things. And so yeah, that's what he was. He's commonly cited as the leader of Egypt, but based upon what I can infer from how African societies were generally structured, um, this was not autocratic rule. It's not like I don't know, the pharaoh walks down the street and just bosses everyone around, tells them what to do. There would have been checks and balances on his power. One of those checks and balances, I'm sure, would have been like a gendered checks and balance, because we know the vast majority of African societies had a balanced system of government. It wasn't a patriarchy, contrary to common belief. Really, the further back in history you go, it actually tends more matriarchal. But you will have male positions of power, but certainly not autocratic um, male rule. But anyway, there were probably equivalent female institutions that would have handled certain aspects of society. I need to do research to know exactly what those were, but based off of what I know about the vast majority of African societies, this had to exist. There had to have been some check on that. But anyway, that was the pharaoh. Now, one common myth about the pharaoh and pharaoh families, I'll call them, not like the royal family, because again, they're not kings. But the one common myth about the family of the pharaohs is that they would commit incest. So it's often said that they would marry their siblings to keep the position of pharaoh within the family and all the privileges that came along with that. However, that is not really true. It is true that the pharaoh or pharaoh to be would marry, and I'm going to put that in quotes for a reason. They would marry or be said to be formally married to someone who's regarded as their sister, right? However, they would not actually reproduce with the sister. They wouldn't have any sort of sexual relationship. Both the pharaoh's female counterpart and the pharaoh would form relationships with other people who were outside of their bloodline, and then have biological children with those people. So really, that marriage was really more symbolic, and maybe you could say spiritual than anything else. there was no actual incest going on among the African pharaohs at this point. And that's because, again, getting into metaphysics now and science, um, virtually all African societies were deeply against incest, way more so than any Eurasian society. If you look historically in most Eurasian societies, it has been okay for people to get married and have kids to someone who's is closely related to them as even their first cousin, right? This is still true in a lot of places in the Middle East. Among Arabs, it's actually a preferred arrangement. It's not necessarily preferred in East Asia, but to my knowledge, it's allowed in most cultures. And it was certainly allowed in Europe among Caucasians until about the 1800s when they started doing their own genetic research after, um, I don't know, maybe over 1,500 years of scientific darkness and realized that that had negative genetic effects. But in Africa, nah, you generally don't find that, and that's because they knew from their science that the Earth, which contrary to common modern belief, is actually a living entity. Um, the Mother Earth, it's a feminine entity, living feminine entity, really does not um, like incest. There are a few rules that because different portions of the earth, because again, the earth, it's one entity, but it's kind of like a hive mind. I might go into this in another lecture in the future. If you want to check it out in the meantime, check out the Medicine Show. Um, they're a great YouTube channel out there. They cover this stuff, but this is where I actually learned this stuff. But essentially, without going too far into it, the earth itself will exact extreme punishment on human beings universally for committing a few different acts. Different portions of the earth, which is kind of, again, kind of like a hive mind, will have different variations in rules, but these are universal, namely, don't murder people, don't steal, and don't commit incest. And if you do those three things, like you'll get a lot of diseases. The earth itself will actually be hurt, so then the food it produces will be polluted. Just stuff goes bad. You don't want to do that. Now, again, modern Western scientists who think they know so much will dismiss this, but virtually every other society on Earth before the modern West knew this to be true. So, who do you trust? A few Western scientists, or like literally everyone else who ever lived? Um, anyway, although most cultures knew this, for whatever reason, I have some theories. Again, I'll go into that in another video. Eurasians kind of bent the incest rule, and um, actually, after a certain point, it's pretty clear why specific groups bent the incest rule because they got stupid. But without going too deep into that, Africans never really did that for the most part. So that would explain why the pharaoh, again going back to it, didn't actually go through with full on incest at this point. Um, yeah, sorry, to make sure it's still on. So they didn't go through with the full on incest. And actually, when you consider that, then you would know that the people that were being called brother and sister in this context, like say the pharaoh or pharaoh to be and his sister, in the modern context, genetically were in many cases probably more like cousins anyway, because it's like, um, say it's like you say, oh, mom and dad are married, but really they're brother and sister, and then they have kids with different people. Then the kids produced from those would be cousins in our common parlance now, and maybe not even first cousins. It keeps going on for generations. So the point I'm making is very far from incest. All this stuff that has to be understood. Um, Now, transitioning from that, I'll talk about marriage in Kemet in general to just get you to know a bit more of what the society was like. Obviously, this was a society that existed over the course of thousands of years. There are many nuances to it. Many of the nuances have been lost to us, so I can't cover everything. But I really want to hit some key things to at least get you guys to know what it was like. There is a tendency when discussing history to just talk about who killed who ruled who sat in the throne, but that doesn't really tell you anything about society. You know, that would be like if I just, you know, described America by listing who was president. That really doesn't tell you shit. But yeah, I'm trying to do a little bit better than that. But anyway, getting on with that, marriage in Kemet. So Kemet was in terms of marriage, and that's a key caveat. In terms of marriage, was a monogamous society. Many other African societies after this, we'll see polygamy. We'll even see some polygyny or polyandry, rather, multiple husbands. But here it was, generally speaking, one husband, one wife. That was the norm. Why was that different than the other African societies? It's not necessarily because they were against non-monogamy as a principle, and I'll say more on that in a second. But essentially, there wasn't as much of a need for multiple marriage because when you see multiple marriage becoming widespread in other societies, it's generally because there's a population imbalance. So, like in, for example, Western Africa, during the era of the so-called slave trade, really a war of enslavement. You know, the term slave trade sanitized what was going on. But again, that's another lecture. Getting ahead of myself. But anyway, in West Africa during that period, because so many men were taken as slaves, there are less men than women, so then you have to get multiple marriages going to make sure every woman has a wife. That's just an example. But that hadn't yet happened in Kemet. So one man, one woman getting married. And primary purpose of marriage was said to be having kids. Marriage would be done with the consultation of the two families, and they would think about joining their line together. Um, but it was primarily about having kids. They didn't really have fancy marriage ceremonies. People were said to be married once the woman entered the man's house. So the man was the one who provided the house, the woman came into it. This is mirrored in other African societies. For example, traditionally in Igbo society, that's said to be how it was. And again, that is because metaphysically, without getting too deep into it, but according to the spiritual science and metaphysics that Africans were aware of, the role of masculine energy, because it's a force that exists in the universe, manifests in human beings as testosterone, is to provide protection from, I guess, physical danger, you can say. So it's like a protective wall in that way. And the role of feminine energy is to kind of, essentially give life and happiness and create things. So it's like you have to. So the masculine energy is like the wall, and the feminine energy is like you could say like the valuable plant that will sprout inside the wall and produce fruit, right? That's kind of the metaphor generally. And even though both men and women have masculine energy, men tend to have more masculine energy, women tend to have more feminine energy. So generally speaking, that's why that role would end up like that. Um, and again, this is not to say that gender roles were hard in Kemet. I don't believe they had like hard gender roles, probably flexible, but there were general gendered ways in which things would proceed, and I'll explain that in a second. But basically, so the woman, once she came into the man's house, they're said to be married. So it's like all these modern day people where they just move in together without a wedding. In ancient Kemet, people would have just been like, "Oh, you're married, right?" That's what happened. So then they would get married and have kids. Now, a lot of people in the modern day, I've seen many scholars look at this arrangement and go, "Okay, they didn't marry for love. Marrying for love is a European concept." And some people even go further than that and say, "Oh, we should start doing this. We need to start arranging our marriage," because a lot of these marriages were arranged. And fuck your happiness, fuck your love, stop reading love stories, just I don't know, have kids and take antidepressants, whatever. But I believe, based off my own analysis, that was not really an accurate representation of how the ancient Kemetians viewed marriage and their philosophy behind it. Because if you look at Kemetian society, there's a lot of artwork and proverbs, literature that talked about the importance of a man loving his wife, how beautiful love was, and things like that. So, and then on top of that, we have to understand that again, these people were working from an African metaphysical framework. And according to African spiritual science and metaphysics, a person does best when they follow the path that is laid out by their truest desires. Let me say it like that without getting too deep into it. So there's such a thing as like superficial desires, things that will get you confused, but like everyone is brought into the world to live life in a certain way, to live a certain truth, to live in a certain state of being. So then, because of that, the challenge of a person is to actually follow their deepest intuition and do what they really, really want to do, not just stuff they think they want to do because they saw someone else doing it, but what they really want to do from the core of their being, right? So because of that, if you were to force someone to go against that, that would be a form of self harm. So in other words, if say I don't know, I met some real nice girl and I was so in love and like, oh, I really want to marry her, and then my family was like, no, go marry like I don't know, Ursula or something. Um, According to like African metaphysical understanding and science, my family would be harming me in that instance. So because of that, individuals and families, I don't think in Comedian society would have generally been um, encouraged to behave like that or do things like that. So couple the understanding of the importance of following your intuition and truest desires with the comedian's own stated value of love, it seems to me like they thought love should be a given in a marriage, right? And another thing to consider is that, again, because remember, the people of Kemet were not the first Africans, right? The older population of Africans are in the western half of the continent. Now, from what I've heard from a friend of mine who does research, heavy research into African history and culture. Actually, the guy who runs the Medicine Shell, check them out. Um, but basically, it is said that in Igbo culture, um, from his research, originally, and remember the Igbos, those are the people who live in this part of West Africa, and are they're the people who live in the region where the oldest evidence of Homo sapien civilization um, exists, right? In their culture, even though the so-called traditional marriage is done a little differently now. Well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. You guys have to forgive me. There's just history is so vast, culture is so vast. I want to say 1,000 things at once, but I gotta condense it for y'all. But essentially, even though, let me say it like this: even though in Igbo culture the way marriage has been done has changed over time, it looks like originally a man would simply marry the first woman rather, that he got pregnant, and it is known for a fact by historical researchers that in Yoruba culture, again, another culture in West Africa, also in modern day Nigeria, fairly close to where Igbos live, that is how marriage happened. In other words, a man would marry the first man or first woman, rather, can't get a man pregnant. I'm sorry if I triggered anyone by saying that, but I mean, you can't do that. I mean, I'll do a different video about gender identity. Don't worry. I know some of you heard that joke and you think I'm like a flaming Republican or whatever. I'll say some stuff in a second that'll get the Republicans wanting to kill me. But anyway, Yoruba culture, man marries the first woman he gets pregnant, right? So now, clearly, right, if you get a girl pregnant, right, clearly I mean, unless you're the luckiest one night stand ever, right? Because for context, in order to get a woman pregnant, on average, a man has to have relations with her 75 times. And that's not like 75 rounds, that's 75 instances. You know what I mean? So just think of, if you're doing it with someone that much, unless you're a fucking sadist, you like them, all right? You might even love them, right? Likely you love them, right? So that would be a baby conceived out of love and passion. And if that was the earliest norm among these African cultures that are older than the Kemetians, and keep in mind how similar African cultures tend to be, um, we can infer um, that they valued love and passion in the creation of children. So now, if we look at Comedian marriage, right, the purpose of marriage is to have children, but they don't want to force people to go against their truest desires. They talk about how important love is, and we can infer they probably thought that love and passion were important in conceiving children. And I do want to do more research on this, but that love and passion point, the stuff I just told you about in some cultures, how marriage was originally done by just marrying a man marrying the first woman he got pregnant, makes me think that Africans of the past believed that a child conceived out of love and passion would generally be healthier than one conceived in a different arrangement. I'm going to be conscious. I won't say that 100% certainty, but I'm really getting a strong hunch based off this evidence I've seen. But anyway, when you take all this together, it seems most likely to conclude that the ancient comedians believed that love and passion were a given, a crucial baseline aspect of a marriage, at least if you want the marriage to be healthy, given that the purpose of marriage was to conceive kids. Because if you even think about it, right, if a man and a woman get together, they don't like each other, they're they're not gonna be I mean, let me just say it. If YouTube censors me because they're a bunch of Puritans, fine. If a man and a woman get married but they don't like each other, they're not attracted, he thinks her breath smells, he thinks he's a pig, whatever, they're not going to be having a lot of sex, probably not going to be conceiving a lot of children if they even conceive anyone at all. You know what I mean? So when you put all that together, I don't think it would be accurate to say that the ancient Comedians didn't value love and that love wasn't viewed as a crucial component of marriage. It just seems that they understood that if you want to conceive kids as easily and healthier and as healthily as possible, love and passion is a baseline requirement for that. So, yeah, I think I would encourage my fellow scholars to reevaluate how they view and analyze marriage among the people of ancient Kemet and the implications of that for our people today. But anyway, that's not necessarily to say that there weren't any just loveless marriages. Obviously, these are human beings; things happen, but I don't think that was the preferred norm. Now, on to the issue of sexual monogamy. Just because the marriages were monogamous, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people were sexually monogamous. Because again, marriage was for having kids, but it wasn't. There was no hard rule like there is in most modern societies that you couldn't have a relationship with anyone outside of marriage. Now, I haven't seen any sources that say exactly how common that would have been. Maybe most people did have monogamous relationships, but maybe they didn't. And I can conclude that a lot of them probably didn't, because even now in modern society, some people do that. It's getting more popular, and this is in a society where that is generally, um, forbidden, or at least it's a cultural taboo. But you can't really find any law or writing or widespread cultural norm saying that like sexual monogamy is a must in Kemet. And that's how it was in most of the world before the rise of Christianity and Islam, really. And Christianity and Islam were not even, um, they weren't even sperm cells at this point, if you know what I'm saying. So yeah, there's that. Then also on the issue of sexuality and gender identity, just want to round out, I guess um, I guess you would call it the gender and sexuality aspect of Canadian society before I talk about certain other aspects of it. Um, just because marriage is for having kids, but that doesn't necessarily mean that um, relationships outside of marriage are bad. Doesn't even necessarily mean that having kids outside of marriage was bad. I don't know if I haven't. I'd have to do some research, but I haven't seen anything saying they categorically thought that was bad either. But it's just marriage would have been the marriage as an institution was for having kids, and they wanted everyone to get married, right? That's essentially their, have kids, reproduce, get the society to continue policy. Because again, if you go into African scientific understanding and metaphysics, um, and I'll go deeper into this in a bit, but essentially, having kids is very important in order to continue the line of a family, in order to ensure that a person and the members of their family could continue to reincarnate because they believed in reincarnation. So that was very important. So that's why that was a big deal. But anyway, I say all that to say, marriage had that purpose, but that doesn't mean that they viewed marriage as excluding certain other things that it excludes now. So on the issue of sexuality, just because men and women like marriage was only between men and women in Kemet doesn't necessarily mean that people couldn't have same sex relationships. Because again, you could have a relationship outside of marriage, and there is no um, law or anything like that in Comedian society that said that same sex relations were bad. And again, that was a normal thing in most societies before the rise of Christianity and Islam. So we can only assume that that was done committing society as well. I know a lot of people want to kill me for saying that, but the facts just are what they are. Um, and then also there's even further potential, at least evidence for that. There was a pharaoh and another high class individual who were buried together, and these were both male, in the manner of lovers, and they were depicted in a painting, kind of like caressing each other. I believe the motion they did symbolized a kiss. Now, it's not 100% certain they were lovers. Maybe they meant something else, but it really looks like they were. So to use an analogy, it's like, if you were to take a picture of me, I don't know, like hugging some other dude while lying on a bed, yeah, you don't have 100% proof that like we were gay and that we were like dating or whatever. That's I mean that it would look pretty. That would be some pretty good evidence. You know what I mean? Straight anyway, but not to say there's anything wrong with anyone like that. Anyway, I'm just illustrating a point. Okay, I hope you all get what I'm saying. I'm just trying to get you guys a flavor of what this society was like. And then also on the issue of gender identity, obviously in modern times you have people that are classified as transgender, non-binary, whatever. And without getting into the debate about, I guess the political and logical validity of that stuff, because again, there's people on both sides of that debate. I'll cover that in a future video, just not now. We can say there were those people like that definitely existed just because they always exist in human society, and there's no reason to believe they're condemned. Now, did they are describe them in the same way we describe now? Like, did they say, "Oh, someone is transgender"? No, I doubt it. But they probably made room for them to exist someplace in their society without overwhelming discrimination. Because again, there is no writing or anything of that nature that says that those people were bad the way it is in modern society. So anyway, that's just a rundown of the ancient comedians' view of, I guess you could say, gender and sexuality. I think the one thing I would add, I said it earlier, but This is not a patriarchal society, so men and women were viewed as being on equal footing because, like all Africans, they believed in the perfect balance between masculine and feminine. And of course, there were general areas of society that men and women generally were in more. To my knowledge, that would have mirrored most African societies. So, for example, I think that the military would have been primarily male, and then the market would have been primarily female. That's how it would be in most African societies. But even in that, that's not a hard rule because in most African societies, they were flexible with that. If there are individuals who are different than the norm, they weren't bad, they're just different. They just did their thing. So, anyway, moving on. Let's talk about the ancient Comedians' language and writing system. So first, the language. Um, the language. Modern scholars don't have perfect knowledge of their language, although from what I've read, I can deduce some things. So one thing you'll notice about Comedian language is that often um, when it's rendered in modern phonetic scripts, let's say that, um, you won't see vowels. Vowels will be missing, right? So because of that, like the word Kemet, and by the way, the word Kemet just means the black land. There's a little bit of debate as to what that means. Some people would say that that is they called it the black land because they were black and they just want to be like, hey, we're black, this is our land, right? Most other scholars I've heard say that was referring to um, the soil around the Nile, which because of the waters and nutrients in the Nile, that mud was black and it was very rich. It was good for growing crops. I'll get to that in a second. I personally think it was more likely the second description. That is that they were calling it the black land because of the mud. Just because I believe that non-blacks were not common enough that I think they would have had to felt to distinguish themselves like that, and also that again, Kemet is the society in this portion, but there are a bunch of other black people in the rest of the Nile Valley civilization. Nubia, we'll discuss in a second, or here you have people here all over the place. So to call this as the Black Land, that would be like someone living in modern day Atlanta, like me being like, oh, I'm the black guy to distinguish myself. Well, there's a bunch of other fucking black people around. Like, that doesn't tell you anything. Um, yes, but anyway, so their language. So it's commonly rendered without vowels, and then when vowels are added in, there's commonly no vowel added at the end of the word, right? And this is unusual because in most African languages, you will know words don't end in consonants. Now, I've heard someone theorize that it doesn't end, that currently when modern scholars render the language, they don't render it as ending in a consonant or in a vowel because they want to make it seem like it's un-African. Either that or they misunderstand it. And they've theorized that Kemet probably had some other vowel on the end, like, I don't know, maybe an E, so maybe they really say Kemete just because that's how African languages generally go. And I can understand that perspective because, again, it is odd for an African language to not have a vowel at the end. However, I actually believe something else is true. I do believe that in their language, unlike most African languages, it would not have ended in a vowel, or words generally wouldn't have ended in a vowel sound, just because when you look at some of the modern day peoples who are descended from the people of Kemet, and we'll get into them in more detail in the future, but namely, a lot of them live in modern day West Africa, in places like Senegal. Then you also have related people in East Africa now who are a bit different, let's say, but they still have that ancestry. So in places like Ethiopia, their languages actually don't often don't end in vowels either, right? And for the people in Senegal, around West Africa, kind of Francophone West Africa, that area, not only do their languages, the words in their languages not end in vowels, but unlike the vast majority of other African languages, they're monotonal. So most African languages are tonal languages. A word could have the same um, spelling. I put quotes around that just because, um, like I'll get into a minute, African language cultures typically didn't have phonetic scripts, so there's not really such thing as spelling. But for the purposes of this example, right, the African languages, in most African languages, two words could have the same spelling, but based off on the tone, which with different vowels are pronounced, it can mean different things. I would give you an example because I do know some Igbo, but I'm bad with my tones. I will be improving that. But right now I'm not quite there, so I can't help you there. But just know that thing. So anyway, based off of that, my theory is that their language generally would have ended in hard sounds, not vowels, and have been monotonal. Again, we can't say with 1,000% certainty just because we don't have any recordings of them speaking, but that's what I've deduced based off of the languages of the modern day peoples who are related to them. Now, as for their writing systems, they did have a writing system. You've heard of them, hieroglyphs, and I know some of you might be confused and be like, wait, I've heard of hieroglyphs in the context of this other group, but again, we'll be getting there. We'll be getting there in the fall, part three, but we're still in part two right now, all right? So be patient, all right? Just enjoy the ride. But anyway, in uh, in Comedian culture, um, they used hieroglyphs to transcribe verbal ideas in a written form, right? So hieroglyphs are a pictorial script as opposed to a phonetic script. So what does that mean? Most modern day societies, virtually all, they use phonetic scripts. And in phonetic scripts, the every symbol that someone draws depicts a sound, right? But in a pictorial script, every symbol that someone draws depicts an idea, all right? And that's why in pictorial scripts, again, pictorial, they kind of, the writing looks more like actual pictures. So if you want to write bird in a pictorial script, you draw a symbol that actually kind of looks like a bird. Whereas in, say, English, right, English writing, which is a phonetic script, you would write BIRD, and someone reads that and goes bird, bird, and then they know what you're saying. But in a pictorial script, you would have just looked at that and then gone, oh, bird. And that's not to, of course, in the pictorial script, not any bird-like picture means bird, and you can make different variations on things to connote slightly different ideas, but nonetheless, you know what something is saying based upon. Hello? All right, sorry, now I'm back. But anyway, like I was saying, let me make sure my volume is up. My volume's up. All right, good. We're going. So, like I was saying, anyway, before my brief technological interruption there, in Kemet they had a pictorial script, and the pictorial script you can tell what symbols mean based upon what they resemble, right? So they're like slightly adjusted pictures. Now there are a few things we got to remember about this pictorial script. The first one, and then I say this based upon my knowledge of other pictorial scripts in Africa, because the big thing is that these pictorial scripts are very characteristic of African culture. The phonetic scripts that we're all familiar with now are really more characteristic of Eurasian culture, but in Africa, typically, it's often said that Africans didn't have writing systems before Europeans came and saved us. That is, um, I would say that's false. However, most the writing systems we had don't fit most people's image of a writing system because they were pictorial scripts. An example of this would be Nsibidi and Uli. In West Africa, it's used among the Igbo people. Or those are two writing systems, and I'll get into the implications of that in a minute. It's used among the Igbo people, Bibio people, Efik people, and South in kind of the eastern part of West Africa and northern part of Central Africa, right? So you have those pictorial scripts. You have similar scripts all over. Basically, well, I won't say that, but many, I'm probably going to say most African groups had pictorial scripts like that. So the Comedian's pictorial script was simply another iteration of that. With the pictorial script, what you have to remember, one key thing to remember is that they likely had several versions of it. And I say that because typically what you see in other African cultures is that one, the like we refer to the comedian um, pictorial script or scripts as hieroglyphs collectively, but they might not have all been one script. There could have been multiple different scripts. Again, the example I gave of Nsibidi in West Africa, Nsibidi was used primarily by men, or is used, and Uli primarily used by women. Could have been a similar thing in Comedian culture. And then on top of that, there could have been a public version and a private version. A public version that would have been used um, by people in their everyday lives to communicate things, and a private version that would have been used by secret societies and um, secret learning institutions, which I'll go into in a second. So that's one thing to consider. And also, modern Western archaeologists, to my knowledge, have not been able to completely decode the Comedian pictorial script. But I would not be shocked if the Africans who are descended from the Comedians, and some of them still call themselves Comedians, so but I'll get into that more in a second, of course. I know what it means, they just don't want to tell them. Partly, maybe they just don't want to tell outsiders, and also partly as part of that even internal secret society thing I'm talking about that you see in most African cultures. The other thing to keep in mind is that the pictorial script likely allowed comedians to communicate with other peoples around them who didn't speak the same language. Because again, what you see with other pictorial scripts in West Africa is that because they depict ideas and not sounds in a specific language, you can have two people who speak a different language can communicate using the pictorial script. Because as long as they know what idea certain symbols depict, then they'll know what it's saying, even if the person who wrote it speaks a different language. So it's likely, in my opinion, that the Comedian hieroglyphs allowed for cross tribal communication. Um, Another thing to consider, again, going back to the subject of the secret societies, is how this would have done the Comedian's pictorial script would have dovetailed with their education system. We know that the Comedians had things called mystery schools. These are the same thing as what are called masquerade societies in other parts of modern Africa. And what these really are actually schools, institutions meant to teach people things. Because in most African societies historically, um, education was done in this way. So prepubescent kids um, didn't go to any formal education institution. It's not like in modern society where your 5 year old goes to school. They wouldn't do that. They'd just be out living their lives. However, the community and the society were structured in such a way that they would naturally teach these kids things. So education would be weaved into children's games, into songs. Um, there would be traditions where older kids would come and tell stories to younger kids, and the stories are fun, but they actually would contain a lot of knowledge. And the kids would learn that way, often without even knowing. Then, when the children got older, probably about beginning at puberty, began to undergo the rituals of becoming men and women. Because again, like in most African societies, I'm sure that the Comedians had rites of passage for kids, certain rites of passage for men, certain rites of passage for women, and then of course that could be flexible if they're individuals who weren't like most men or weren't like most women. But anyway, that would be the structure. So as you began those rituals, you would a child would know what profession they wanted to enter. And again, this the belief was that children are born into the world perfect. It's not like now when you think that a child's born, they're confused, they don't know anything, they need to be molded. I believe the child is born perfect, and therefore, if they follow